The heavy clang of the gavel echoed in the cavernous courtroom, silencing the low murmurs of the onlookers. A bead of sweat rolled down James Carter's temple as he stood behind the defendant's table, his hands gripping the wooden edge like a lifeline. Across the room, the judge's sharp eyes bore down on him, an unspoken verdict already written in their cold, unyielding gaze. You stand accused of theft, breaking and entering, and assault. How do you plead? The judge's voice was a monotone, devoid of empathy, the words slicing through the suffocating air. James swallowed hard, his voice trembling but firm. Not guilty, Your Honor. A ripple of whispers swept through the room, their judgment louder than any words. James's lawyer, a young woman named Tessa, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but her face betrayed the truth. She knew the odds were stacked against them. The prosecutor rose, his tailored suit pristine and his tone dripping with calculated authority. Your Honor, the evidence against Mr. Carter is overwhelming. A witness saw him leaving the scene of the crime, and his fingerprints were found on the alleged weapon. The state requests he be denied bail due to the severity of his crimes. James's heart sank. He opened his mouth to protest, but the judge's raised hand silenced him. This court has heard enough. Bail is denied. A gasp broke out in the room, followed by stunned silence. James's mother, seated in the gallery, clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. The chains on James's wrists seemed to tighten as the bailiff approached, ready to lead him back to the holding cell. But just as the judge began to rise, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. Wait, I have testimony that will change everything. Every eye turned to the figure at the back of the courtroom. The tension was electric, the promise of revelation hanging in the air. What happens next will change everything. Stay tuned to uncover this gripping story of courage and redemption. The courtroom emptied slowly, the heavy silence trailing the attendees like an unwelcome shadow. James Carter sat alone in his holding cell, the weight of the day pressing on his chest. The clang of the barred door as it locked shut echoed in his ears, a grim reminder of his reality. James had always been a fighter. Growing up in a neighborhood riddled with broken promises and systemic neglect, he'd learned to stand tall against the odds. His mother, Grace, had worked tirelessly to keep their family afloat, often pulling double shifts at the diner to ensure James and his younger sister, Mia, had food on the table. It's not what you face, James, Grace would say, her hands rough from years of labor as she cupped his face. It's how you rise that matters. But rising above felt impossible now. The accusations against him were as false as the smile the prosecutor had worn, yet they stuck like tar, refusing to be washed away. James knew how the system worked, knew how it had worked against men like him for generations. Across town, Tessa Rodriguez, James's lawyer, pored over stacks of files in her cramped office. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead as her brow furrowed in concentration. Tessa wasn't new to cases like James's. She'd seen firsthand how evidence could be twisted, how narratives could be manipulated to paint innocent people as criminals. But this one felt personal. She thought back to the witness testimony, the so-called evidence presented in court. Something didn't add up. The fingerprints were too conveniently placed, the witness too vague in their recollection. Tessa knew she was fighting an uphill battle against a system that rarely admitted its flaws, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Meanwhile, in a quiet suburban home, Judge Henry Calloway sipped his evening whiskey, his expression unreadable. The case had stirred something in him, though not empathy. No, Calloway had long since buried any notions of fairness under years of bias and indifference. He saw men like James Carter not as individuals but as numbers in a system he believed was working just fine. The next morning, James sat across from Tessa in the sterile visiting room of the detention center. They're not going to let me walk out of here, are they? He asked, his voice low but steady. Tessa leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. Not yet, but we're not done fighting. There's someone out there who knows the truth. We just have to find them before it's too late. James nodded, the flicker of hope in his chest warring with the cold dread that had taken root. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his family, for his community, for every person who'd ever been silenced by an unjust system. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the quiet battles waging within its walls. But for James, Tessa, and the unexpected ally waiting to step forward, the fight was just beginning. Days turned into weeks, each passing moment a test of James's endurance. Inside the detention center, life was a brutal reminder of the world's indifference. The clamor of metal doors slamming, the hollow laughter of guards, and the simmering tension among inmates created an atmosphere of constant unease. James spent his nights replaying the events of that fateful evening in his mind, searching for the missing piece that could prove his innocence. Tessa, meanwhile, threw herself into the case with relentless determination. She combed through witness statements, reviewed evidence, and visited the crime scene repeatedly. The neighborhood where the alleged crime took place was eerily quiet, its streets lined with houses that seemed to watch her every move. She knew the truth was hidden here, somewhere amidst the cracks and shadows. But the deeper she dug, the more resistance she faced. Calls to potential witnesses were ignored, and the few who did speak to her offered vague or conflicting accounts. It was as if a shroud of fear or complicity hung over the community. When she tried to subpoena surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store, she was met with excuses and delays. In court, the prosecutor pushed hard, painting James as a violent repeat offender, despite his clean record. He played on stereotypes, weaving a narrative designed to evoke fear rather than justice. Men like Mr. Carter, he said during a pretrial hearing, pose a threat to the safety of our community. The words stung James. But he kept his composure. He'd learned long ago that anger only fed the biases against him. Still, the weight of the accusations pressed down on him, each hearing feeling like another nail in the coffin of his freedom. Outside the courtroom, Grace and Mia rallied what little support they could. Grace knocked on doors, spoke at church meetings, and pleaded with anyone who would listen. But the responses were tepid at best. "I'll pray for you," they said, or "I'm sure the truth will come out." The undercurrent of doubt in their voices was And then there was Judge Calloway, whose rulings were consistently skewed against James. Requests for leniency, motions to challenge evidence denied. Calloway's disdain for James was palpable, though he masked it behind a veneer of professionalism. To Calloway, this was just another case, another statistic. But James wasn't alone. Unknown to him, a man named Daniel Porter had been watching the case unfold from the sidelines. Daniel, a quiet figure with a past he rarely spoke of, had stumbled upon something that didn't sit right. He worked maintenance at a building near the crime scene and had seen something that night, a detail that contradicted the prosecutor's timeline. At first, Daniel hesitated. Stepping forward meant drawing attention to himself, and in a system that often punished the messenger, that was a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. But as he watched news coverage of James's hearings, the look in Grace Carter's eyes, a mother's unyielding hope, despite overwhelming odds, gnawed at him. Meanwhile, Tessa uncovered a lead. A piece of evidence, overlooked in the initial investigation, suggested that the weapon James was accused of using had no fingerprints at all, contrary to the prosecutor's claims. It was a small crack in the prosecution's case, but Tessa knew it wasn't enough. She needed someone who could corroborate James's alibi or discredit the witness's testimony. Back in the detention center, James found solace in letters from Mia. "We're not giving up on you," she wrote. "You're not just a brother, you're my hero." And heroes don't fall. Her words gave him strength, but the darkness of his surroundings was hard to shake. The tension reached a boiling point during a preliminary hearing. As the prosecution introduced more evidence, James felt his hopes slipping away. Tessa stood firm, challenging every point, but the judge's rulings were clear they were losing ground. It was then, just as despair threatened to consume them, that Daniel Porter made his decision. He picked up the phone and called Tessa. "I think I have something you need to hear," he said. His voice was steady, but the weight of his words carried an unspoken promise the fight wasn't over yet. The courtroom was unusually tense as the trial entered its most critical phase. The prosecution seemed emboldened, their confidence swelling with each passing day. They presented a polished case, supported by rehearsed witnesses and cherry-picked evidence. James sat silently at the defense table, his face a mask of calm, though his knuckles were white from gripping the edge of his chair. Tessa, standing across from the jury, exuded a quiet resolve. Her file of evidence was worn from hours of use, but her conviction remained steadfast. Today she had a trump card, though even she wasn't entirely certain how it would play out. Daniel Porter was seated just behind her, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His presence had been a late but potentially game-changing addition to their case. The prosecution wrapped up their argument with a flourish, addressing the jury with a tone that bordered on triumphant. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence speaks for itself. This is not a case of wrongful accusation. This is a case of justice served. I urge you to do what is right." Judge Calloway nodded as the prosecutor returned to his seat. Then, turning to Tessa, he said, "Miss Rodriguez, you may proceed with your defense." Tessa rose slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the silence to settle before speaking. "Your Honor, members of the jury, the defense would like to call a surprise witness to the stand, Mr. Daniel Porter." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The prosecutor's smug expression faltered, replaced with a flicker of unease. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow, clearly displeased with the unexpected development. "Approach the bench," he ordered. Tessa stepped forward, her voice firm. "Your Honor, Mr. Porter's testimony only became known to the defense yesterday. He has critical information that directly challenges the prosecution's timeline and the credibility of their key witness." The judge's frown deepened, but after a moment of deliberation he sighed. "Very well. Proceed." Daniel Porter walked to the stand with deliberate steps, the weight of 1,000 doubts visible in his gait. He swore the oath, his voice steady but low. Sitting down, he looked out over the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting James's. "Mr. Porter," Tessa began, her voice measured, "can you tell the court where you were on the night of October 14th? "I was working late," Daniel replied. "I'm a maintenance worker at the Harborview apartment complex, about 2 blocks from the scene of the alleged crime. And did you see anything unusual that night?" Daniel hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "I saw someone running down the street toward the alley where the crime supposedly happened. They dropped something metallic, like a crowbar, before disappearing into the shadows." Tessa nodded. "And was this person the defendant, James Carter?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "The man I saw was shorter, stockier, and wearing a red hoodie. Mr. Carter doesn't match that description at all." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection. This testimony is purely circumstantial and unverifiable." Tessa turned to the judge. "Your Honor, Mr. Porter's testimony challenges the prosecution's timeline and casts doubt on their identification of the defendant. I request that the court allow him to continue." Judge Calloway rubbed his temples but motioned for Daniel to proceed. "Mr. Porter," Tessa continued, "did you report what you saw that night?" "I did," Daniel said. "I told the police about the man in the red hoodie, but they didn't seem interested. They said they already had their suspect." Tessa's jaw tightened. "And you've never seen this man again?" "No," Daniel replied. "But I know what I saw, and it wasn't James Carter." The courtroom fell into a tense silence. Tessa returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Daniel's testimony had introduced a shadow of doubt, but she knew it wasn't enough. The prosecutor, recovering quickly, launched into a scathing cross-examination, attempting to discredit Daniel's credibility. "Mr. Porter, isn't it true that you have a record? A history of misdemeanors?" "Yes," Daniel admitted, his voice steady. "I've made mistakes, but that doesn't mean I'm lying about what I saw." The prosecutor smirked. "So, we're supposed to take the word of a man with a criminal record over the police and our eyewitness." Daniel didn't flinch. "You can believe what you want, but the truth doesn't change." Tessa watched the jury closely, noting the flickers of doubt in their expressions. The prosecutor's tactics were effective, but Daniel's quiet conviction had left an impression. When the defense rested, the tension in the room was palpable. As the jury filed out to deliberate, James turned to Tessa, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it was enough?" Tessa placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've done everything we can. Now we wait." The hours stretched on, the courtroom emptying as the day wore on. Grace and Mia sat beside James, their hands tightly clasped together. The minutes felt like an eternity. Finally, the jury returned, their expressions unreadable. The foreman rose, clearing his throat. "In the case of the People vs. James Carter, we find the defendant." The room held its breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. "Not guilty." The words echoed like a thunderclap, breaking the oppressive silence. Grace let out a sob, collapsing into tears as Mia hugged her tightly. James sat frozen for a moment, the weight of relief crashing over him like a tidal wave. But the moment was bittersweet. As the courtroom erupted into a mix of cheers and stunned murmurs, James's gaze lingered on Judge Calloway, whose expression was as cold as ever. Justice had been served. But the battle against the biases and systemic failures that had nearly destroyed his life was far from over. Outside the courthouse, James hugged his mother and sister tightly, their tears mingling with laughter. Tessa stood nearby, a small smile on her face. "You're free, James," she said softly. "But don't forget, this fight isn't just about you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." James nodded, the fire of determination rekindling in his eyes. As they walked into the evening light, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. But deep down, James knew his journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. James stood outside the courthouse, the fresh evening air filling his lungs for the first time in weeks. Freedom felt surreal, like waking from a nightmare, but still carrying the weight of it in his chest. Grace and Mia clung to him, their arms a fortress of love and relief. Even as they celebrated, James couldn't ignore the sting of everything he'd endured. Tessa joined them on the courthouse steps, her briefcase slung over her shoulder. She looked weary but triumphant. "You're free now," she said, offering a soft smile. "That's what matters." James met her gaze, his voice low but steady. "Free for now. But how many others are still trapped in there? How many don't get a Tessa Rodriguez fighting for them?" Tessa nodded, understanding the unspoken commitment in his words. "It's a broken system, James. But change starts with voices like yours." Over the following days, James found himself grappling with the emotional aftermath. The detention center's walls no longer confined him, but the scars left by the experience were deep. He couldn't shake the memories, the guards' cold indifference, the prosecutor's scorn, and Judge Calloway's unyielding bias. Every interaction, every moment of dehumanization was etched into his mind. Mia noticed the shadow that lingered over her brother. One evening, as they sat on the porch, she slipped a sketchbook into his hands. "Draw it out," she said simply. You always said art helped you make sense of things. James hesitated but opened the book. Slowly, deliberately, he began sketching a portrait of the courtroom, with Judge Calloway towering over him like a specter. As he worked, he felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. The lines and shadows on the page were his way of reclaiming the narrative, of turning pain into power. His response to James's exoneration was mixed. Some neighbors reached out with words of support, expressing regret for not standing up sooner. Others avoided eye contact, their silence speaking volumes. Grace, ever the optimist, took it upon herself to turn their ordeal into a teachable moment. She organized a town hall meeting, inviting local leaders, activists, and community members to discuss systemic racism and the flaws in the justice system. Change doesn't happen in isolation, she said to a room full of hesitant faces. It starts with uncomfortable conversations, with acknowledging our biases and deciding to do better. To her surprise, people began to open up. A young black man shared his own story of being wrongfully detained. A white woman admitted to her unconscious biases and vowed to educate herself. Slowly but surely, the walls of indifference began to crack. For Tessa, the case became a turning point in her career. She'd always fought hard for her clients, but James's trial reignited her sense of purpose. She joined forces with a coalition of civil rights lawyers, dedicating herself to challenging discriminatory practices in the legal system. One day, she visited James at his small art studio, where he had begun channeling his experiences into powerful pieces that resonated with the community. "Your work," she said, gesturing to a painting of a young black man in chains breaking free, "it speaks louder than words ever could." James smiled faintly, his brush still in hand. "Art's always been my voice. Maybe it's time I used it for something bigger." And so James's journey took on a new dimension. He became a vocal advocate for justice reform, using his art to highlight the human cost of systemic failure. His paintings, raw and evocative, drew national attention, sparking conversations that reached far beyond his hometown. Yet, the most poignant moment came when Daniel Porter, the unlikely witness who had risked everything to tell the truth, visited James. The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of what they'd endured hanging between them. "I didn't do it for recognition," Daniel finally said, his voice quiet. "I did it because it was right, but I wasn't sure anyone would believe me." James extended a hand, gripping Daniel's firmly. "You gave me back my life. That's something I'll never forget." Their conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship, two men brought together by a shared struggle for justice. Daniel, inspired by James's courage, began volunteering at local community centers, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of James's case became evident. Local policies were scrutinized, Judge Calloway faced public outcry, and a broader conversation about judicial reform gained traction. It was far from a perfect resolution, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in a long and arduous fight. On the anniversary of his acquittal, James stood in front of a packed gallery, his latest exhibition drawing crowds from across the state. Each piece told a story of pain, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. As he addressed the audience, his voice rang with quiet determination. "This isn't just my story," he said. "It's the story of countless others who've been silenced, overlooked, and discarded. But silence doesn't mean defeat. Together we can turn whispers into a roar, one that demands change." The crowd erupted into applause, but James's focus was on the faces before him, young, old, black, white, a mosaic of humanity united by a shared purpose. As he stepped down, Grace and Mia embraced him, their pride shining brighter than the gallery lights. Tessa stood nearby, her arms crossed and a rare smile on her face. James met her gaze and nodded. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. And he meant it. James stood in front of his final painting, his fingers brushing the edges of the canvas as he took in the weight of his work. The courtroom he had depicted was dark and oppressive, the scales of justice tipped in favor of those who wielded power. Beneath it, the words "justice is not blind, it sees what it chooses" were written, stark and unapologetic. He had lived through the injustice, had felt its sting firsthand, and now he poured that anger, that understanding, into his art. He took a step back, his heart heavy but his spirit resolute. This journey wasn't just about clearing my name, he had once said, and he believed it more than ever now. It was about confronting a system that's failed so many. It's about shining a light into the shadows where injustice hides, forcing it to face the truth. James had seen the worst of the system. The cold indifference of Judge Calloway, the systemic biases that had left him imprisoned, and the endless wait for a voice that could cut through the noise. But now, the battle had shifted. He had reclaimed his freedom. But his fight had only just begun. It was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or discarded by a system meant to protect them. The change, James knew, started with courage. The courage to speak out, to act, and to believe in the possibility of change. But courage alone was never enough. It had to be backed by action. A single voice could challenge a single judge, but a movement could challenge an entire system. He understood that now. He had felt the ripple of support when people believed in his story, in his truth. It was a reminder that there was strength in unity, in the collective will to make things right. His story hadn't just sparked a conversation. It had ignited a fire. People who had once stayed silent now had the courage to speak. Neighbors who had kept their distance were standing beside him. Young children, inspired by his resilience, picked up pencils and brushes, determined to tell their own stories. The community that once watched him with suspicion now saw him as an example of perseverance, someone who didn't just survive but fought to make a difference. James thought back to his first encounter with Daniel Porter, the man whose unexpected testimony had changed everything. They had both been products of a system that sought to break them, but through their shared pain, they had found solidarity. Daniel had risked everything to tell the truth, and in doing so, he had given James something priceless: a chance at redemption, a chance at freedom. James wasn't the same man who had walked into that courtroom months ago. He had found something deeper than justice. He had found a purpose, and with that purpose he would continue to speak out. His art, once an escape from reality, was now a platform for truth. Every painting he created, every brushstroke, was a testament to the people he had met along the way, the ones who had believed in him, the ones who had fought beside him, and the ones who had endured the same struggles. The world was not going to change overnight, but James knew that change was possible. He had seen it, felt it, and lived it. And as long as there was breath in his body, he would keep fighting. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been denied justice. For everyone who had been told that their lives didn't matter. In the end, it was clear silence fuels injustice. But action, real, unrelenting action, demands change. James stood in his studio, his gaze fixed on the canvas before him, and for the first time in a long time he felt peace. The battle wasn't over, but he was no longer fighting alone, and neither was anyone else.